My golden child brother tried to take my house, but I fought back and finally stood up for myself. Hey Reddit, I'm Nia, 32, and I've spent my whole life feeling like the second-class sibling in my family. My younger brother, Caleb, 29, is the golden child, my parents' pride and joy, the one who can do no wrong. Despite being coddled his entire life, Caleb is still struggling to find his way, constantly leaning on our parents to bail him out of every mess he creates. Things hit a breaking point recently when Caleb decided he wanted to claim my house, thinking he was entitled to everything, just like always. But this time, I decided I wasn't going to let him get away with it. Here's the story of how I fought back against my brother's entitlement and finally stood up for myself. Growing up, my parents always made it clear that family came first. They prided themselves on being there for their kids, supporting us through every challenge, and doing whatever it took to make us happy. But somewhere along the line, support turned into enabling, especially when it came to my brother, Caleb. From the moment he was born, Caleb was treated like the center of the universe. He was the golden child, the one my parents showered with attention, praise, and endless second chances. Caleb was always a handful, mischievous, loud, and full of energy. While I was the quiet, responsible one who did well in school and never caused any trouble, Caleb was the complete opposite. He was the kid who would throw tantrums in the grocery store until he got the candy he wanted, the teenager who got caught sneaking out late at night, and the college student who flunked out of his classes because he partied too much. But no matter what Caleb did, my parents were always there to bail him out, making excuses for his behavior and sweeping his mistakes under the rug. I remember countless times when Caleb's antics overshadowed everything else. I was 3 years older than him, and from a young age, it felt like my role in the family was to be the good child, the one who didn't need constant attention or rescuing. My parents would often tell me, "You're so mature for your age, Nia," or "We don't have to worry about you," as if that was supposed to be a compliment. But as I got older, I realized that what they really meant was that I didn't get to have needs, problems, or feelings because Caleb was always the priority. One of my earliest memories of Caleb's golden child treatment was when I was 10 and Caleb was 7. It was my birthday, and I'd been looking forward to it for weeks. My parents had promised me a small party with my friends, a cake, and a special gift. I'd been eyeing a beautiful necklace with a tiny star pendant that I'd fallen in love with at a local shop. But on the day of my party, Caleb threw one of his infamous tantrums because he didn't want to share the attention. He cried, screamed, and refused to come out of his room. My parents spent the entire afternoon consoling him, promising him extra presents to calm him down. By the time they finally joined my party, it was too late. My friends were uncomfortable, the cake was half-eaten, and my parents' attention was squarely on making sure Caleb was happy. I didn't get my star necklace that year. Instead, my parents handed me a hastily wrapped book and a rushed apology, saying they'd make it up to me. But they never did. That incident wasn't an isolated event, it was a pattern that defined my childhood. As Caleb and I grew up, the favoritism became more apparent. Caleb was praised for even the smallest achievements, getting a participation trophy in Little League, winning a minor school competition, or even just getting through a day without causing trouble. My accomplishments, on the other hand, were often brushed aside. When I brought home straight A's, my parents would nod and say, "That's great, Nia. We knew you could do it." But when Caleb passed a test he hadn't studied for, they'd throw a celebratory dinner, complete with ice cream and extra screen time. It was as if Caleb's successes were rare treasures to be celebrated, while mine were expected and therefore unremarkable. It wasn't just about school, either. Caleb's behavior at home was excused constantly. He'd make messes, leave his clothes all over the house, and argue with our parents without any real consequences. Once, when he was in middle school, he got caught shoplifting candy from a convenience store. My parents were horrified, but instead of punishing him, they grounded him for a day and then took him out for ice cream to talk about his feelings. Caleb was the type who would apologize with a smirk, knowing he could get away with anything. And he did. Meanwhile, I was expected to be the responsible one. I did my chores without being asked, took care of our family dog, and even helped my mom with cooking and cleaning. But no matter how much I contributed, it was always Caleb who received the lion's share of praise. "Caleb's trying his best," my mom would say, as if his bare minimum was worthy of a medal. I often felt like my parents were blind to the ways Caleb manipulated them, twisting every situation to his advantage. And it left me feeling increasingly resentful. Caleb went through college like it was an all-expenses-paid vacation, courtesy of our parents. He switched majors 3 times, dropped classes left and right, and eventually flunked out entirely. My parents didn't seem to care. They were more concerned about how Caleb was feeling than the fact that he'd wasted thousands of dollars on tuition and had no degree to show for it. "He's just finding his way," my mom would say, brushing off his failures as though they were minor inconveniences. "He'll figure it out." Meanwhile, I was working my way through college, juggling a full course load with a job at the campus library to help cover my expenses. I didn't have the luxury of messing up or taking a break. I was on my own, and every dollar I earned mattered. When I graduated with honors and got my first job, my parents were proud, but it was nothing compared to the praise they showered on Caleb for even the smallest accomplishment. When Caleb finally landed a low-paying job at a local car dealership, my parents celebrated as if he'd become CEO. I couldn't help but feel resentful. Why was my hard work always overshadowed by Caleb's bare minimum? The most painful part was that Caleb never seemed to appreciate any of it. He saw my parents' generosity as something he was entitled to, a never-ending safety net that would catch him no matter how many times he fell. And my parents encouraged it, constantly bailing him out and refusing to let him face the consequences of his actions. They were so desperate to keep Caleb happy that they never stopped to think about what it was doing to me. When I was 26, I achieved something I'd been working toward for years. I bought my first house. It wasn't anything fancy, just a modest 3-bedroom fixer-upper in a quiet neighborhood, but it was mine. I'd saved every penny I could, worked overtime shifts, and even picked up freelance gigs on the side to make it happen. Walking through the front door for the first time, I felt a surge of pride. This was my space, my safe haven, and a symbol of everything I'd accomplished on my own. The process of buying my house wasn't easy. I spent months researching neighborhoods, attending open houses, and saving every extra dollar I could. I remember staying up late at night, running through my finances to make sure I could afford the down payment. I cut back on all my expenses, no more takeout, no more shopping sprees, and no vacations. I was determined to make this happen, even if it meant sacrificing my social life and working long hours. My friends would often invite me out, but I declined, knowing that every dollar spent on a night out was a dollar less toward my dream. When I finally closed on the house, it was one of the proudest moments of my life. I remember standing in the empty living room, looking around at the bare walls and imagining all the possibilities. I could paint the walls any color I wanted, hang up my artwork, and finally have a space that was completely mine. I even started a Pinterest board filled with DIY home projects, from repurposing old furniture to creating a cozy reading nook by the window. I felt like I was finally building something for myself, something that wasn't tied to Caleb or my parents. My parents were proud, too, at least at first. They came over to help with the move, bringing boxes of old family photos and some mismatched furniture they'd been storing in their garage. We spent the weekend painting walls, hanging curtains, and making the house feel like a home. My dad helped install new shelves in the kitchen, and my mom brought over some potted plants to brighten up the backyard. For the first time in a long time, I felt like my hard work was being acknowledged. I'd done this, I'd created something that was completely mine. But of course, Caleb couldn't let me have that moment. Within weeks, he started showing up unannounced, making himself at home without so much as a phone call. He'd crash on my couch, eat my food, and leave a trail of mess behind him like a tornado. I didn't mind at first. He was my brother, after all, and I figured he was just going through a rough patch. But his visits became more frequent, and it quickly became clear that Caleb saw my house as just another thing he was entitled to. Caleb's unannounced visits started to become a regular occurrence. At first, he'd come over once or twice a week, usually on the weekends. He'd stroll in like he owned the place, bringing his laundry and expecting me to feed him. I remember one Saturday morning when I'd planned to sleep in after a long week at work. Instead, I was woken up by the sound of Caleb blasting music in the living room. He'd let himself in with the spare key I'd given him for emergencies and decided to have a mini dance party while I was still in my pajamas. I confronted Caleb about his behavior, but he just shrugged it off. "Relax, Nia. It's just a bit of fun," he'd say, dismissing my frustration like it was no big deal. It wasn't just the noise, it was the way he treated my space with complete disregard. He'd leave dirty dishes in the sink, his clothes strewn across the living room, and crumbs all over the couch. I'd come home after a long day at work, looking forward to some peace and quiet, only to find Caleb sprawled out, making a mess of everything I'd worked so hard to create. One afternoon, I came home from work to find Caleb sprawled out on my couch, playing video games. He'd helped himself to my leftovers and left dirty dishes all over the kitchen. My annoyance quickly turned to anger when I noticed that he'd also gone through my mail, opening a letter from my bank about my mortgage. "Caleb, what the hell?" I snapped, snatching the letter out of his hands. "You can't just go through my stuff." Caleb barely looked up, his focus still on the game. "Chill out, Nia. I was just bored." I felt my blood boil. "This is my house, Caleb. You can't just show up whenever you want and act like you own the place." Caleb rolled his eyes. "Relax. It's just a letter. I was just checking it out. You know, making sure you're doing okay." The audacity of his response left me speechless. Caleb had never once taken an interest in my life or my responsibilities, and now he was pretending to be concerned? I knew it was just an excuse, a way to deflect from his own lack of boundaries. But what bothered me most was the entitlement, the way he waltzed into my home without permission and treated it like his own personal playground. I told Caleb he needed to respect my space, but my words seemed to fall on deaf ears. He continued to drop by whenever he felt like it, bringing friends over without asking and even hosting impromptu poker nights in my living room. My parents, of course, were no help. When I tried to explain how Caleb's behavior was affecting me, they brushed it off, saying, "He's just going through a phase. Be patient with him." But it wasn't just a phase. Caleb's entitlement was growing, and I felt like I was losing control of my own home. He'd make snide comments about how I should loosen up and let him stay over whenever he wanted. When I finally put my foot down and told him he needed to stop treating my house like a hotel, Caleb accused me of being selfish. "You've got this big house all to yourself," he argued. "What's the big deal if I crash here sometimes? You're being dramatic." I was stunned. Caleb genuinely believed that he was entitled to my space, my time, and my resources, just like he'd been entitled to everything else our whole lives. It was the same old story, but this time, it was personal. My house was supposed to be my sanctuary, the one place where I could escape from the chaos of my family, and Caleb was ruining that. Things took a turn for the worse when Caleb lost his job at the car dealership. It wasn't entirely unexpected, he'd been slacking off for months, showing up late, and calling out sick more often than not. But when he was finally let go, he acted as if it was the greatest injustice in the world. My parents, predictably, rushed to his defense, blaming everyone but Caleb for his situation. They paid his bills, covered his rent, and tried to reassure him that he'd find something new soon. But Caleb wasn't interested in finding a new job. Instead, he started spending even more time at my house, lounging around like he owned the place. I'd come home from work to find him sprawled out in my living room, watching TV and eating my food. It was like having an overgrown teenager who refused to take responsibility for anything, and I was getting fed up. One evening, I sat Caleb down and told him he needed to figure things out. "I love you, but you can't keep doing this," I said firmly. "You need to get a job and get your life together." Caleb shrugged, not even bothering to look up from his phone. Yeah, I'm working on it." But he wasn't. Weeks turned into months, and Caleb showed no signs of changing. He was content to mooch off my parents and crash at my place whenever he felt like it. I knew I needed to put my foot down, but every time I tried, Caleb would brush me off or turn the situation around, making me feel like I was the unreasonable one. Then, out of nowhere, Caleb dropped a bombshell. One afternoon, as we were sitting in my kitchen, he casually mentioned that he was thinking about moving in permanently. "You've got all this space, Nia," he said, gesturing around my house. "And I'm really struggling right now. I think it would be a good idea if I just moved in for a while. You know, until I get back on my feet." I was stunned. Caleb wasn't just asking to crash on my couch anymore, he was asking to take over my home. I tried to stay calm, but I could feel my anger rising. "Caleb, this is my house. I worked hard to buy it, and I'm not looking for a roommate." Caleb's expression darkened. "Oh, come on, Nia. Don't be like that. I'm your brother. You're just going to leave me out in the cold?" I stood my ground. "This isn't about leaving you out, Caleb. You need to take responsibility for your life. You can't just keep expecting everyone to bail you out." But Caleb wouldn't let it go. Over the next few weeks, he kept pushing the idea, dropping hints every chance he got. He'd bring up how much easier it would be for him to find a job if he didn't have to worry about rent or bills. He even started talking about how he could help fix up my house, as if that would justify him moving in. But the final straw came when Caleb started involving our parents. I got a call from my mom one afternoon, her voice dripping with concern. "Nia, I think you should really consider letting Caleb stay with you. He's struggling so much, and he just needs a little support." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My parents, once again, were bending over backward to accommodate Caleb, completely ignoring my feelings in the process. "Mom, I've already told Caleb that he can't move in," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "This is my house, and I get to decide who lives here." My mom sighed, clearly exasperated. "Nia, he's your brother. He just needs a little help. Can't you be more understanding?" It was the same guilt-tripping, manipulative tactic my parents had used my whole life to get me to bend to Caleb's needs. But this time, I wasn't going to cave. "No, Mom. I'm not going to let him take over my house just because he's too lazy to get a job. I've worked too hard for this." Caleb didn't take my refusal well. He started showing up more frequently, leaving his things around my house as if he was slowly trying to claim it. He'd bring up the idea of moving in every chance he got, and when I pushed back, he'd accuse me of being selfish and uncaring. My parents were no help. They continued to pressure me, constantly reminding me that family helps family. One day, I came home to find Caleb sitting on my porch with a moving box. He wasn't even trying to be subtle anymore. "I figured I'd start bringing some stuff over," he said nonchalantly, as if we'd already agreed on his plan. I'd had enough. "Caleb, you need to leave," I said firmly, my voice shaking with anger. "You're not moving in, and you're not going to force your way into my life. I've told you no, and I mean it." Caleb's expression turned icy. "You're being ridiculous, Nia. You're really going to turn your back on your own brother?" But I didn't waver. "Yes, I am. Because this isn't about you needing help, it's about you taking advantage, like you always do." Caleb stormed off, furious, but I didn't care. I was done playing his games, done letting him manipulate me and my parents. For the first time, I felt like I was taking control of my life, and I wasn't about to let Caleb or anyone else take that away from me. After that confrontation, things between Caleb and me were tense, to say the least. He stopped coming over, but he didn't give up on his plan to claim my house. Instead, he went behind my back, trying to get my parents to convince me to let him stay. My mom called me constantly, pleading with me to be the bigger person and help Caleb out. My dad even suggested that I was being too harsh and that family should stick together no matter what. I was furious. Caleb's entitlement was bad enough, but now my parents were actively trying to undermine me, using guilt and manipulation to wear me down. I knew I needed to set boundaries, not just with Caleb but with my entire family. I couldn't keep letting them dictate my life, especially when it came to something as important as my home. I decided to have a family meeting, something we hadn't done in years. I called my parents and Caleb, telling them we needed to talk. We met at my house, the one place I felt I could stand my ground. I could tell Caleb was annoyed as soon as he walked in, and my parents looked uneasy, like they knew this conversation wasn't going to go their way. I didn't waste any time. "I need to make something very clear," I began, my voice firm. "This is my house. I bought it, I pay for it, and I get to decide who lives here. Caleb, you are not moving in, and that's final." Caleb scoffed, crossing his arms. "You're unbelievable, Nia. I'm your brother. How can you be so heartless?" I turned to my parents, who were looking at me with a mix of disappointment and frustration. I've spent my whole life putting Caleb first because that's what you both expected of me. But I'm done. I'm done being guilted into sacrificing my happiness just to make him comfortable. My mom tried to interject, but I held up my hand. No, Mom. You've enabled Caleb for years, and it's not helping him. He's not learning anything, and you're only making things worse. He needs to figure this out on his own, and I'm not going to be his safety net. There was a heavy silence. My parents looked at each other, clearly uncomfortable, and Caleb just stared at me, his face flushed with anger. But I didn't back down. I'd spent too many years being the quiet, accommodating sister, and I was finally standing up for myself. I'm not being selfish, I continued, my voice shaking with emotion. I'm protecting what's mine, and I'm setting boundaries because I deserve respect. Caleb, if you need help, I suggest you start by getting a job and taking responsibility for your life. I'm not your fallback plan. Caleb stormed out, slamming the door behind him, and my parents sat there, stunned. I knew they didn't understand, I knew they were still caught up in the belief that Caleb was the one who needed saving. But I couldn't keep sacrificing my peace for their misguided loyalty to him. After that meeting, I felt a mix of relief and sadness. I knew I'd done the right thing, but it was hard not to feel guilty. I loved my family, and part of me wished things could be different. But I also knew that I couldn't keep letting them take advantage of me. Caleb needed to grow up, and my parents needed to stop enabling him. Over the next few months, I focused on reclaiming my space in my life. I made my house truly feel like home, decorating it the way I wanted and filling it with things that brought me joy. I even adopted a rescue dog, a sweet golden retriever named Max, who quickly became my best companion. My home was finally my sanctuary, and I was determined to keep it that way. My parents eventually backed off, though it was clear they still didn't fully understand my decision. They continued to support Caleb financially, but I made it clear that my house was off limits. Caleb, on the other hand, took my refusal personally. He stopped talking to me, blaming me for his problems and accusing me of turning my back on family. It hurt, but I knew I couldn't let his anger control me. I started going to therapy, something I'd been considering for a long time. My therapist helped me work through the guilt, the resentment, and the complicated feelings I had toward Caleb and my parents. I realized that setting boundaries didn't make me a bad person, it made me strong. I was learning to prioritize myself, something I'd never been taught growing up in Caleb's shadow. I also began focusing on things that brought me joy and fulfillment. I took up painting again, something I hadn't done since college. I turned one of the spare bedrooms into an art studio, filling it with canvases, brushes, and bright colors. It became my sanctuary within a sanctuary, a place where I could express myself without judgment. I even signed up for a local art class, where I met other people who shared my passion. It was a small but powerful step toward reclaiming my identity, separate from the roles I'd been forced to play in my family. I also started reconnecting with friends I'd drifted away from over the years. I'd always been too busy trying to keep the peace at home, but now I was making time for myself and the people who truly valued me. We'd go out for coffee, have game nights, and plan weekend getaways. My circle of support was growing, and it was filled with people who didn't expect anything from me except my authentic self. Final update, moving forward in finding peace. Hey Reddit, it's Nia again. It's been nearly a year since Caleb tried to claim my house, and I wanted to share an update. My relationship with my family is still complicated, but I'm in a much better place. I've learned to set boundaries, to say no without feeling guilty, and to stand up for myself, even when it's hard. Caleb eventually found a new job, though it wasn't without my parents' help. He's still living off their support, and our relationship is strained, but I've come to terms with that. I can't change Caleb, and I can't change my parents' enabling behavior. All I can do is protect my peace and focus on building the life I want. My house has become my sanctuary again, a place where I can breathe, relax, and feel safe. I've thrown myself into new hobbies, like gardening and painting, and I've even started hosting small get-togethers with friends, something I never felt comfortable doing before. My home is finally mine, and it feels incredible to have taken back that control. I've realized that my worth isn't defined by my family's opinions or by how I measure up to Caleb. I'm enough, just as I am, and I'm finally learning to believe that. To anyone out there dealing with a golden child sibling or feeling overshadowed by family dynamics, just know that you have the right to stand up for yourself. You don't have to sacrifice your happiness to accommodate others, and you don't have to let guilt dictate your decisions. It's okay to say no, to set boundaries, and to protect what's yours. Thanks for reading, and here's to finding the strength to fight for yourself, even when it feels like the hardest thing in the world.